Karen thought she could win, but she messed with the wrong cop at a lakeside cottage. What would you do if a complete stranger showed up at your private retreat, demanding you hand over the keys to your family home? It was a serene Saturday morning in mid-June, the kind that makes you believe the world is at peace. The sun was climbing lazily above the treetops, casting warm golden light across Blue Ridge Lake. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, and the distant trill of birds punctuated the silence. Sitting on the wooden deck of my lakeside cottage, coffee in hand, I breathed in the tranquility that had become a rarity in my busy life as a police officer. This place wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary, a piece of history my family had cherished for generations. But then, the crunch of tires on gravel shattered the calm. Frowning, I set down my mug and walked toward the sound. Visitors were rare here, and unexpected ones even more so. As I rounded the corner of the house, a gleaming black SUV pulled into the driveway. The engine cut off, and out stepped a woman in her mid-40s, exuding a confidence that bordered on entitlement. She was impeccably dressed, her designer sunglasses perched atop her perfectly coiffed hair. Two girls, likely in their early teens, climbed out after her, glued to their phones and looking thoroughly uninterested. The woman's eyes landed on me, and she strode forward with a wide smile that felt more like a rehearsed act than genuine warmth. "You must be the caretaker," she said brightly. "We're here to check in." Confused, I shook my head. "I'm sorry, but, check in for what?" Her smile faltered slightly but didn't waver. "For our stay, of course. This is 17 Lakeside Drive, isn't it? We booked this cottage for the week." Something told me this serene morning was about to take a very sharp turn. "You must be mistaken," I said, keeping my tone polite but firm. "This cottage isn't a rental property. It belongs to my family. We don't rent it out." The woman, who I'd later learn was named Karen, froze for a moment. Her confident smile wavered, but she quickly recovered. Adjusting her designer sunglasses, she huffed. "That's impossible. This is the address I was given. I paid good money to book this place for a week. My daughters and I have been driving for hours." I looked past her to the two girls, who were still standing by the SUV, barely acknowledging the conversation. One of them, the older-looking girl, glanced up from her phone and rolled her eyes as if this was just another one of her mother's moments. "I'm sorry for the confusion," I said. "But I can assure you, this is a private residence. If you booked something online, it's possible there was a scam or a mix-up." Karen's expression hardened. Her face began to flush as anger replaced the confusion. "A scam?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Are you suggesting I got scammed? That's absurd. I booked this through a reputable site. I have the confirmation email and everything." "I understand this is frustrating," I replied, trying to de-escalate the situation. "If you'd like, I can help you look up nearby hotels or actual rental properties in the area." "I don't want your help," Karen snapped, cutting me off. "I want the keys to this house that I already paid for." At this point, the younger of the two girls, a shy-looking preteen, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, maybe we should just quiet," Karen barked, her tone sharp enough to make the girl shrink back. "I am handling this." I took a calming breath, suppressing the frustration bubbling under the surface. This wasn't my first encounter with someone entitled, but her audacity was on another level. "Ma'am, I'm trying to be reasonable here, but you need to understand." "What I understand," Karen interrupted, her voice climbing to a near shout, "is that you're trying to steal my vacation. I have a legally binding contract for this property, and I am not leaving until you hand over those keys." Her volume and tone were starting to attract attention. The older girl, who had been scrolling aimlessly on her phone, looked up with a mix of embarrassment and dread. "Mom, you're being really loud," she mumbled. "Madison, stay out of this." Karen snapped at her eldest daughter before turning back to me. Her once polite facade was completely gone, replaced by indignation and fury. I don't know who you think you are, but you're not going to ruin my trip. Now give me the keys before I call the police. I couldn't help but let out a short, incredulous laugh. Ma'am, you're threatening to call the police on me for not letting you into my house? Karen crossed her arms, standing her ground. That's exactly what I'm saying. I will not be bullied by someone like you. Her comment hit a nerve. Bullied? I repeated, my voice firming. You showed up uninvited, demanded access to private property, and now you're threatening me. That's not how this works. You don't know who you're dealing with, she yelled, her voice echoing across the quiet lakeside. My husband is a very important man, and when he hears about this, he'll make sure you lose everything. Mom, please stop, Madison said again, her tone more pleading this time. This is so embarrassing. But Karen wasn't listening. She jabbed a manicured finger in my direction. Mark my words, you will regret this. I'll make sure of it. Her words weren't just empty threats, they were a glimpse into her deeply entitled mindset. I'd dealt with difficult people before, but Karen was determined to escalate this confrontation to a level I wasn't prepared for. As I stood there, I realized this encounter was far from over. The tension was thick in the air, Karen glaring at me like I'd just committed an unspeakable crime by denying her access to my family's home. Her daughters stood awkwardly by the SUV, Madison looking mortified while the younger girl, Sophia, seemed too afraid to speak. I could feel my patience wearing thin, but I reminded myself to stay calm. This wasn't the first entitled person I'd encountered, though something about Karen told me she wasn't going to back down easily. Karen jabbed her finger toward me again. I'm done with this nonsense. You're nothing but some underpaid caretaker who thinks he can play gatekeeper. Give me the keys now, or I swear I'll. Ma'am, I cut in, my voice firm but controlled, I've already explained that this property is not for rent. If you continue to trespass and refuse to leave, I'll have no choice but to call the authorities. Authorities? Karen let out a shrill laugh, throwing her head back like I'd just told her the most absurd joke she'd ever heard. You're going to call the police? On me? Do you have any idea who my husband is? He'll have your job in a heartbeat. I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation, I replied. You're trespassing on private property, and I've asked you multiple times to leave. This is your final warning. But Karen wasn't hearing any of it. She turned to her daughters and barked, Girls, start unloading the car. We're staying here whether this idiot likes it or not. Sophia hesitated, clearly conflicted, but Madison didn't move. She crossed her arms and muttered, This is such a bad idea, Mom. Madison. Karen snapped, her face reddening. Do as I say. I stepped forward, positioning myself between Karen and the house. No one is unloading anything, I said. You need to leave now. Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously. For a moment, I thought she might back down, but then something shifted in her demeanor. Her face twisted with fury, and before I could react, she lunged at me, her hand clawing toward my pocket. I instinctively stepped back, narrowly avoiding her grasp. Ma'am, do not touch me, I said firmly. This is your last warning. Step back and leave the property. But Karen wasn't listening. You think you can talk to me like that? She screamed, her voice echoing across the stillness of the lake. You have no idea who you're dealing with. And then, without warning, she raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp sting spread across my cheek, and for a moment, I just stood there, stunned. The sound of the slap echoed in the quiet morning air. Madison gasped audibly, and Sophia let out a small, shocked whimper. Even Karen seemed momentarily taken aback by her own actions, her chest rising and falling as she tried to catch her breath. Mom! Madison shouted, her voice filled with disbelief. "What are you doing?" Karen didn't answer. Instead, she looked at me, her expression a mix of defiance and panic. I straightened, keeping my composure despite the adrenaline surging through me. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my badge. I held it up so she could see it clearly. "Ma'am," I said, my voice calm but authoritative, "I am an off-duty police officer, and you have just committed assault." Karen's face drained of color. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You're lying," she stammered. "There's no way you're a cop." "You thought wrong," I replied, locking eyes with her. "Now, I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." Karen took a step back, shaking her head furiously. No. You can't do this. It was just a little slap. I didn't mean. Mom, stop it. Madison pleaded, stepping toward her mother. You're making it worse. But Karen wasn't done. She turned to her daughters and screamed, "Call your father. Tell him to bring the lawyers. I'm being assaulted." I stepped forward, pulling out my handcuffs. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for assault. Resisting will only add to your charges." Karen flailed wildly as I reached for her arm, yelling incoherent protests about her status in the community and how I'd regret this. It took every ounce of restraint to keep my movements professional and controlled as I secured the cuffs around her wrists. Her daughters stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Madison finally spoke, her voice trembling. "We didn't sign up for this, Mom. Just stop." Karen didn't respond. She was too busy screaming accusations of police brutality at the top of her lungs, her voice piercing and relentless. I took a deep breath, ignoring the tirade as I began reciting her rights. The once serene lakeside morning had devolved into absolute chaos, and I had a sinking feeling this was only the beginning of a much bigger mess. Karen's screams shattered the stillness of the lake as I tightened the handcuffs around her wrists. Her face twisted in rage, and she struggled against my grip, attempting to pull free. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," she shrieked. "Do you have any idea who my husband is? You'll lose your badge for this." Her younger daughter, Sophia, cowered by the SUV, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Madison, on the other hand, looked like she wanted the earth to swallow her whole. Her arms were crossed, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and quiet defiance. "Mom, stop it," she muttered under her breath. "You're only making things worse." Karen ignored her daughter's plea and turned her wrath back on me. "This is ridiculous. I'm a respected member of my community. You're just some rent-a-cop trying to play hero. Get these handcuffs off me now." I took a calming breath and replied firmly, "Ma'am, you are under arrest for assault. Resisting will only add to your charges." "You can't arrest me for a little slap," she screamed. "This is insane. My husband will have you fired by the end of the day." Her accusations and threats grew louder, drawing the attention of a few passing boaters on the lake. They slowed their pace, curious about the commotion, and I could feel their eyes on us. The entire situation was spiraling out of control, and Karen seemed determined to make it as public and dramatic as possible. I pulled out my phone and called for backup. "This is Officer Collins. I need assistance at 17 Lakeside Drive. I've got a suspect in custody for assault, and I'll need transport." Karen's face twisted with disbelief. "You're seriously calling for backup? For me? You're pathetic." Ignoring her, I turned to her daughters. "Girls, do you have someone you can call to come pick you up? A relative or a friend?" Sophia looked at Madison, unsure of what to say, but Madison spoke up. "Our dad," she muttered. "He's in Atlanta right now, but he could probably come." "That's a good idea," I said gently. "Let him know what's happened and ask him to head this way." Another officer will arrive shortly to stay with you until he gets here. Karen's face turned an even deeper shade of red. You're calling my husband into this, she spat. He'll destroy you. You don't know the kind of connections we have. Mom, Madison said sharply, her tone filled with uncharacteristic resolve, just stop. Please. Before Karen could respond, the crunch of gravel signaled the arrival of my backup. A patrol car pulled up, and Officer Parker stepped out, his brow furrowed as he surveyed the scene. He approached with a calm professionalism that only years on the force could bring. Well, Parker said, his tone dry, looks like you've had an eventful morning. You could say that, I replied with a tight smile. She's been charged with assault. I've already informed her of her rights. Karen immediately launched into a new tirade, her voice shrill and grating. This is harassment. Police brutality. You're all going to regret this when my husband gets here. Parker raised an eyebrow and looked at me. Sounds like a fun one. Let's get her in the car. Karen planted her heels into the ground, refusing to move. I'm not going anywhere. I demand to speak to your supervisor. You can do that at the station, Parker replied coolly. He guided her firmly but gently toward the patrol car, ignoring her flailing and shouting. Madison and Sophia stood a few feet away, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Madison broke the silence. We didn't ask for this, she said quietly. I told her we should just leave. I turned to her, my tone softening. I know. This isn't your fault. You're doing the right thing by staying calm. As Parker secured Karen in the back seat of the patrol car, I walked back to her daughters. Another officer will arrive shortly to stay with you. Just tell them the truth about what happened. You're not in trouble. Sophia nodded, and Madison mumbled a small, thank you. Karen's screams were muffled now, her shouts of, I'll sue you all, barely audible from inside the car. Parker gave me a knowing look as he shut the door. You've got yourself a real Karen here. I let out a short laugh. Yeah, and something tells me this isn't the last I'll hear from her. As Parker drove away with Karen in tow, I watched Madison and Sophia. The older girl seemed lost in thought, her shoulders tense as if carrying the weight of her mother's actions. Something about her expression told me this story was far from over. It didn't take long for the storm to begin. By the time I returned to my cottage later that day, Karen's threats were already making their way into action. My phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications from colleagues and updates from the department. Karen's husband, Robert Warren, had apparently wasted no time calling in favors. Robert, a well-connected businessman based in Atlanta, had a reputation for being ruthless when it came to protecting his image. True to form, he had mobilized a small army of lawyers, PR agents, and media contacts to launch a full-blown counterattack. The first blow came that very evening. I was scrolling through my email when an alert from a local news site popped up. The headline read, Local officer accused of excessive force against mother of two in Lakeside confrontation. Beneath the headline was a picture of Karen, tearfully recounting her version of events outside the Fannin County Police Department. She had swapped her entitled demeanor for one of victimhood, presenting herself as a loving mother who had been unfairly targeted. She slapped me so hard, my wrist might be sprained, Karen sobbed dramatically in the video clip attached to the article. All I wanted was to enjoy a peaceful vacation with my children, but this power-hungry officer decided to make an example out of me. It's humiliating and unjust. My jaw tightened as I watched her performance. The comments section was already flooded with sympathy for Karen, with users calling for my suspension or worse. Her carefully crafted narrative was beginning to take root, and the public was lapping it up. The next day, I arrived at the station only to find the tension palpable. Conversations abruptly stopped as I walked past. Colleagues who had once been friendly now avoided eye contact, their smiles replaced with wary glances. Chief Bradley called me into his office, his face grim. "David," he began, leaning back in his chair, "I've just had a very unpleasant call with Mr. Robert Warren. He's claiming that you used excessive force against his wife and are guilty of misconduct." "That's completely false, Chief," I replied, trying to keep my frustration in check. Karen slapped me, and I followed procedure to the letter. "I believe you," Chief Bradley said, his voice calm but firm. "But you need to understand something. The Warrens are powerful, and they know how to play this game. They've already contacted several media outlets, and there's a lot of pressure on the department to launch a formal investigation." I sighed, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on my chest. "So what happens now?" "For now," he said, "you'll be placed on administrative leave while Internal Affairs conducts their investigation. It's protocol." "Administrative leave?" I repeated, stunned. "I'm the one who was assaulted." "I know," Bradley said, raising his hands to calm me. "But this is bigger than just the facts. The Warrens are spinning a story that's already gaining traction. We need to approach this carefully." As I left his office, a mix of anger and disbelief churned inside me. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. Her husband was turning this into a public spectacle, and I was being painted as the villain. Over the next few days, the attacks escalated. Robert Warren appeared on multiple news networks, calling for accountability and demanding that I be fired. "No officer should be allowed to abuse their power this way," he declared solemnly, his polished demeanor hiding the manipulative man I suspected him to be. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForKaren and #AbuseOfPower, amplifying the narrative the Warrens had carefully constructed. Even the front door of my house wasn't spared. One morning, I found the word PIG spray-painted across it in bold red letters. Meanwhile, Karen continued her performance. At one point, she held a press conference where she dramatically wore a wrist brace, claiming it was evidence of the police brutality she had suffered. Her act was so exaggerated that part of me wanted to laugh, but the growing support she garnered was anything but funny. The most painful part, however, was the distance growing between me and my fellow officers. While a few close colleagues, including Officer Parker, privately voiced their support, most of the department chose to remain neutral, wary of associating with someone under such heavy scrutiny. As the days turned into weeks, I began questioning everything. How could the truth be so easily twisted? How could someone like Karen and her husband weaponize wealth and influence to turn their wrongdoing into a crusade for sympathy? But the hardest pill to swallow came when I learned that Madison and Sophia, Karen's daughters, were refusing to corroborate my version of events. They're claiming they didn't see what happened clearly, Chief Bradley informed me during an update. It sounds like the Warrens have gotten to them. I clenched my fists, the injustice of it all burning like fire in my chest. Karen had turned her own children into pawns in her twisted game. The truth was slipping further out of reach, and every step I took felt like wading through quicksand. But even as the Warrens' campaign against me reached its crescendo, a quiet determination began to build inside me. They had money, power, and connections, but I had something they couldn't buy, the truth. And I wasn't about to let them bury it without a fight. 2 weeks into the chaos, when I was starting to lose hope, my phone rang. The number on the screen was blocked. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Officer Collins," I said cautiously. There was a brief pause before a young, trembling voice came through. "It's Madison. Karen's daughter." I sat up straighter, instantly alert. Of all the people I expected to hear from, Madison was not one of them. "Madison," I said carefully. "What can I do for you?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. I can't take it anymore. The lies. The pressure. It's all too much." I could hear the strain in her voice, the weight of everything she had been holding in. "I understand," I said gently. But you should know that coming forward could have serious consequences, especially with your parents. Are you sure this is what you want to do? She hesitated for a moment, but then her tone shifted, becoming more resolute. Yes. What they're doing is wrong, and I don't want to be part of it anymore. We arranged to meet discreetly at a small cafe on the outskirts of Blue Ridge. I arrived early, scanning the room nervously. When Madison walked in, I barely recognized her. She looked smaller, weighed down by stress and fear, but her expression was firm, determined. As she slid into the chair across from me, she took a shaky breath and pulled out her phone. I recorded some of their conversations, she said, her hands trembling as she placed the phone on the table. My mom doesn't know. My heart pounded as I pressed play. Karen's voice, unmistakably smug and calculating, filled the air. We'll say he grabbed me first, Karen was saying. That'll make people believe he's violent. And Madison, you need to stick to the story. Tell them you were too scared to see what happened. Don't mess this up. I looked up at Madison, who had tears in her eyes. There's more, she said, scrolling through her phone. Another recording played, this time Robert's voice joining Karen's. Just keep saying you didn't see anything, Robert instructed. This officer is nobody. Once we're done, he'll lose his job, and we won't have to deal with this mess anymore. The sheer audacity of their scheme made my blood boil, but I kept my focus on Madison. This is huge, I said, my voice steady. But are you absolutely sure you want to use this? Turning on your parents is not an easy choice. Madison nodded, tears streaming down her face. They've been like this my whole life, she said quietly. Controlling. Manipulative. They'll do anything to get what they want, no matter who they hurt. I'm done being part of it. I want to do the right thing. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently. You're incredibly brave for coming forward. This isn't easy, but it's the right thing to do. Over the next hour, Madison poured out everything. She described how Karen and Robert had pressured her and her sister, Sophia, to lie about what had happened. How they'd promised her new clothes, a new phone, and even a car if she stuck to their story. But it wasn't just the bribery, it was the sheer toxic environment she'd endured for years. They've always treated people like they're beneath them, Madison said bitterly. But this time, I couldn't stand by and let them ruin your life. It's not fair. Before we left, Madison handed me a thumb drive containing copies of the recordings and a written statement she'd prepared. I'm ready to tell the truth, she said firmly. No matter what happens. I knew the risks she was taking. Karen and Robert wouldn't take this betrayal lightly, and I couldn't imagine how hard it must have been for Madison to go against her own family. But in that moment, I saw the kind of strength and integrity that gave me hope. With Madison's evidence in hand, I finally felt the tide begin to turn. The truth was on my side, and now I had the courage of a young girl willing to stand up to years of manipulation and control to back it up. This wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about holding Karen and Robert accountable and giving Madison a chance to reclaim her life. And together, we were about to shake the foundation of their carefully constructed lies. The evidence Madison provided was a game changer, but I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Karen and Robert had invested so much in their fabricated story that they wouldn't let it crumble without a fight. But now, I had the truth on my side, recordings that captured their lies and manipulation in crystal clear detail. The first step was to present the evidence to Chief Bradley. When I handed him the thumb drive containing Madison's recordings, his brows furrowed as he listened to Karen's voice plotting her narrative. When he reached the part where Robert urged his daughters to stick to the story, he let out a sharp exhale and leaned back in his chair. This changes everything, Bradley said, his tone decisive. This is exactly what we needed. The department acted swiftly. Internal Affairs reopened their investigation, this time with Madison's statement and recordings as the centerpiece. Karen and Robert's carefully constructed facade began to crack as the truth seeped into the narrative they'd worked so hard to control. The media, ever hungry for a sensational twist, latched onto the new developments. Stories shifted overnight, flipping the narrative from abusive cop targets innocent mother to teen daughter exposes parents' lies in high-profile case. Madison's bravery became the focal point, and her recording circulated widely, painting a damning picture of Karen and Robert's schemes. Madison's first public appearance was a turning point. Clad in a simple blouse and jeans, she sat nervously in front of the cameras at a press conference organized by the district attorney's office. Despite her visible anxiety, her voice was steady as she spoke. "I've been silent for too long," she began. "My parents pressured me and my sister to lie about what happened that day. But I can't let their actions destroy an innocent person's life. Officer Collins didn't do anything wrong. My mother's actions were wrong, and I'm here to tell the truth." Her words were like a hammer shattering Karen and Robert's public image. Comments on social media shifted drastically. Sympathy for Karen evaporated as people rallied around Madison, praising her courage. The hashtags #JusticeForMadison and #TruthWins began trending, replacing the previous smear campaign against me. Meanwhile, Karen and Robert scrambled to salvage what little they could. Robert made a statement dismissing Madison's claims as the misguided actions of a confused teenager. But his efforts fell flat when the recordings were publicly released, leaving no room for doubt about their guilt. The district attorney wasted no time filing new charges against Karen for obstruction of justice and witness tampering. Robert, who had tried to distance himself from the incident, was also charged as a co-conspirator. Their lawyer, Mr. Silverman, resigned from the case under public pressure, his reputation irreparably damaged. On the day of the preliminary hearing, the courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators. Karen, usually so composed and arrogant, looked visibly shaken as the recordings were played for the court. Her confident demeanor faltered further when Madison took the stand. Madison's testimony was powerful in its simplicity. She described how her parents had coerced her and her sister, the constant fear of defying them, and the relief she felt now that she was telling the truth. Karen's attempts to meet her daughter's gaze were met with cold indifference. "I love my family," Madison concluded, her voice trembling. "But I can't let their actions define who I am. This is my chance to do what's right." The court erupted into murmurs as she stepped down, her head held high. The judge's ruling was swift and unforgiving. Karen and Robert were both denied bail, deemed flight risks due to their wealth and influence. As they were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Karen's cries of outrage echoed through the halls. "You're going to regret this," she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "All of you." But her words held no power anymore. Walking out of the courtroom, Madison looked over at me. "Thank you for believing me," she said softly. "No," I replied, smiling. "Thank you for having the courage to stand up for what's right." In the days that followed, the media frenzy only grew. Madison became a symbol of integrity, a brave young woman who defied her toxic upbringing to stand on the side of truth. Karen and Robert's fall from grace was swift and brutal, their wealth and influence no longer able to shield them from the consequences of their actions. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. The truth had finally come to light, and justice was no longer just a hope, it was a reality. But I also knew this victory belonged as much to Madison as it did to me. Without her bravery, the truth might have remained buried under the weight of lies. With Karen and Robert behind bars, life slowly began to return to normal, or at least, what I hoped would feel normal again. Madison moved in with an aunt in Atlanta, cutting ties with her parents for the foreseeable future. The media frenzy quieted down, replaced by the next scandal, and I finally had time to breathe. One bright Saturday morning, just a few weeks after the court's ruling, I returned to my cottage at Blue Ridge Lake. The air was crisp, the lake glistening under the sunlight. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, and let the quiet settle around me. It felt good to finally enjoy this space without chaos looming over it. But as I turned to unlock the door, I noticed something off. The flower pots on the porch were tipped over, soil spilled across the wooden planks. The lock on the door looked scratched, as though someone had tried, and failed, to force it open. A chill ran down my spine. Stepping cautiously inside, I scanned the room. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the sense of intrusion was undeniable. Someone had been here. I immediately called the local authorities, who confirmed my suspicions. "It looks like an attempted break-in," the officer told me. "Whoever it was didn't get far, but I'd recommend beefing up your security just in case." I nodded, unease gnawing at the back of my mind. "Thanks," I said, trying to shake off the paranoia. "I'll install some cameras." But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. A week later, it happened again. This time, it wasn't subtle. The front door had been kicked open, and the house ransacked. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out, family heirlooms smashed. The sense of safety I'd worked so hard to reclaim was shattered in an instant. The police came again, documenting everything. "Looks personal," one officer said, scanning the damage. "Do you have any enemies?" Enemies. The word hung heavy in the air. My mind immediately went to Karen and Robert. But that was impossible, they were both still in custody, awaiting their final sentencing. Weren't they? I checked with the district attorney's office and confirmed that Karen and Robert were indeed still incarcerated. But then who? My thoughts drifted to Mr. Silverman, their disgraced lawyer. Could he have a vendetta against me? Or was it someone else entirely, someone I hadn't even considered? The truth hit me like a cold slap. Karen's words echoed in my memory from the courtroom, "You're going to regret this. All of you." I had assumed her threats were empty, the desperate cries of a woman who had lost everything. But what if they weren't? What if she had allies on the outside, people willing to do her bidding? Suddenly, the victory I had fought so hard for felt fragile, the weight of unseen threats looming large. That night, as I sat on the deck overlooking the lake, I realized something unsettling: the fight wasn't over. Justice had been served in court, but some battles don't end with a gavel. I would have to remain vigilant, not just for my safety but for Madison's as well. Karen may have been silenced for now, but her influence, and her hatred, ran deep. What would you do if someone like Karen turned your life upside down? If you were in Madison's shoes, would you have had the courage to stand up against your family? Why or why not?